Hello, everyone. So I'm Martin van Staden, the editor-in-chief of BeingLibertarian.com and the editor-in-chief of RationalStandard.com. I've been a non-fiction libertarian writer for what is it now? Since 2014. That's 4 years. I've been quite successful in it. I've been published in the mainstream media, and as I said, I run two libertarian publications where I also often publish myself. One of the benefits of being an editor. And yes, I'm a passionate writer, and I've been asked by African Students for Liberty, a group of which I am still a part of its leadership, to share some tips and thoughts about nonfiction libertarian writing with some aspiring African libertarian writers. So that is what this podcast is going to be about, and I hope you will find some benefit out of it. So just some disclaimers about what's going to follow. These are tips for writing articles intended for a mainstream audience, not academic writing. It's not analysis or anything like that. That's very specific. It's for your general op-eds that you see in places like the New York Times or your local newspaper in the opinion section, or on professional blog type deals. So this isn't really going to help you with your academic writing or writing in-depth analysis. It's not going to help lawyers who need to write legal opinions or any of that. It may provide some pointers, but in general, this is really aimed at non-fiction articles for a mainstream audience. Um, it's also directed at libertarian writers, more new libertarian writers, but I'm sure any libertarian writer of however long time he's been writing can draw benefit out of this. Um, I'm sure that writers of other persuasions may find benefit in this, but when I formulated these ideas, I had libertarians specifically in mind. So take that as you will. And then crucially, and I can't emphasize this enough, I am not an expert in writing. A lot of people think that just because I'm an editor, I have a degree in English or something like that. That's not the case. I have a degree in law, and in many ways that means that I really suck at English more so than other people. I speak legalese, not English, so I'm not the go-to guy when you have problems with grammar and linguistics in general. So just to put that out there, so it's very likely that people with more knowledge about English are gonna poke holes through what I have about to say, and that's fine. I am completely open about the fact that I am not an expert on writing per se. These are simply ideas that I have learned over the 4 years of my writing, some from my experience, and these ideas have brought me far. I've been quite successful, as I've said. I've never really had any big criticisms about the way I write. Nobody has ever really criticized the use of my language and so forth. So these ideas have brought me far. I'm sure they can help you a lot. But yeah, just to put that out there to any English teachers and any university professors in English, yes, I know what I'm about to say is probably going to be nonsense to you, but I'm sure that everyone who is tuning in who wants to learn about becoming a libertarian writer will find some benefit in this. Okay, so without further ado. Okay, so my first tip, and really my most important tip, is do not overthink your writing project. Do not overthink your writing in general. Do not overthink an idea for an article. Do not overthink, period. If you only take one thing back from this podcast, it is do not overthink it. That should ring in your mind forever, for as long as you are a writer. Do not overthink it. So, to unpack this a little bit more, um, research for any writing project is obviously important. You can't write without knowing what you're talking about in general. You need to have some information at least. Um, but this is not academic writing. So don't think that you need to don't overdo it. You shouldn't overdo it. If you intend to write an article about the minimum wage and spend the next 3 weeks researching the minimum wage, you are overdoing it. If you have the general principles of the minimum wage, for example, if you understand the general principles of it and the general consequences of it, you already have enough to start and basically finish your op-ed. Now you can do some research on specific examples to spice your article up, but do not overdo the research because that's going to make your project too difficult, and it's gonna demoralize you because you've in your mind you've already created something much bigger than it actually is. So for example, if you can't find something out, let's say your your starting assumption is that the minimum wage is bad, and you can't really find out why it's bad. Don't let that dissuade you. Go back to your principles. As libertarians, our principles would tell us that the minimum wage is something that is enforced by government, and already there is an element of force there, and there you have your answer why the minimum wage is bad already. Work around that. Of course, there's a lot of economic arguments for why the minimum wage is bad, but if you can't find any of that necessarily, or all of that, so again, don't overthink it. You don't need to find every little sliver of evidence, then go back to your principles, and you'll usually already have enough. And yeah, the economic things are going to come to you, for example. So don't overthink it. um, you definitely need to set limits on your writing project. Don't think that if you've picked a topic to write about, that your article needs to be totally comprehensive or that it needs to be the final word on that topic. So to stick with our minimum wage example, if you decide to write about the minimum wage, you don't need to unpack the whole thing from when it started in a few decades ago and where it's been tried and what all the different academics are saying about it. You don't need to do the whole thing with it. Pick your you need to decide before you start writing your article what you want to say about something, and then generally stick around that. And later I'm going to get to the point about brevity, and that's going to help you limit your article. So more on that later. So yes, then the most important part about not overthinking it is that whatever you do, just start writing. Just start writing. So it doesn't matter if you're not done with your research yet, if you haven't collected all your thoughts yet. Put pen to paper, or if you're on a computer, as would be the case mostly nowadays, just start writing. Put something down, and that brings us to my next step for writers. Start with your conclusion. So this is not an academic paper where you are investigating something, where you need to state your research objectives and your starting assumptions and then investigate whether those assumptions are true. You are writing for a mainstream audience, you already have your ideas, so you know what message it is you want to get across. Otherwise, why are you writing an article? You don't really have a reason to write an article if you don't already have an agenda with that article. So once you know what your agenda is and you start writing, remember, just start writing. The first thing you really should put down is your core idea, your essentially your conclusion. You need to start with your conclusion and build around that. So again, with the minimum wage, right, the minimum wage is bad because it it forces people to do things that they do not want to do. That's your core message about the minimum wage. Start with that, put that down, and then build the rest of your article around that. Um, So this is really important. Don't start your article by asking questions about your core thought or anything like that. You need to really start your project by starting with your conclusion. Otherwise, it may become you may lose direction, and if you write it over several days, you may even lose your core message entirely as new thoughts enter your mind. So just somewhere on your paper, put down your core thought and build around that. And so, since you're starting with your conclusion, it's also a good idea to summarize your conclusion in the first paragraph of your article. We are taught that conclusions must be at the end of a piece, but with op-ed articles, it works differently. It's not a good idea to hide the most important message, which is your core idea, at the very end of your article. A lot of new writers start out this way. They go the whole introduction, body, conclusion route, whereby a reader would need to get through your entire article to really get to the climax, to the most important thing that they need to take away from the article. That's a bad idea, because if you don't catch your reader in your first paragraph, even in the first lines of your first paragraph, you've probably lost them. They will either close the tab and go on, or put down the paper and go on with whatever else they're busy with. Or if they're on a computer, they'll bookmark your article if it looks kind of interesting, and tell themselves they'll read it later. And I think we're all guilty of bookmarking stuff to read later and then never reading it. I'm definitely guilty of that. So if you don't grab your audience in the first paragraph of your article, you're gonna waste your time essentially, because very few people are gonna read all the way to the end, especially if it's a longer article. So start with your conclusion, and even if you don't put the conclusion you started with in those words, the essence of your article needs to be summarized. The most important points need to be summarized in that first paragraph, in order to grab your reader and keep them for the rest of the article. So yeah, start with your conclusion and summarize your conclusion in your first paragraph, and better yet, in the first lines of your first paragraph. So the next step is quite important, and a lot of your editors will also tell you this when you send in articles, and this is a mistake that a lot of new writers make, and that is, we tend to write too long when we start out. We over justify things, we overemphasize things, but the fact is that brevity is best. So keep your article as short as you possibly can, within reason, of course. Don't just make it 100 words, because then it means you're lacking some justification. But I've been told, and my experience has indicated that between 500 and 800 words is really the sweet spot, because that's when you really have your reader's attention, and they don't bookmark and say they'll read it later. They have enough time to get through the whole thing. If it's between those between 500 and 800 words, and 1,200 words, I would say, is the max when you're writing a normal opinion piece. Um, so longer articles do carry a kind of prestige and gravitas. That it's more analysis, and it's something that can be cited and so forth. So I can understand why one would want to write something longer. It just seems more prestigious. But ordinary readers simply don't care, and they don't have time to read long pieces. As a general rule, you need to assume that your readers do not have a lot of time to just keep on reading. So keep it short. Justify what you need to justify, but don't over justify. Don't keep on repeating why you believe what you believe. Some repetition is warranted, but keep it within reason. So yes, brevity is best. So the next step, I basically titled it as "Don't be a slave to popular opinion." So this basically just says that you are a writer and you are writing because you enjoy writing. You're not writing for anyone else. You're writing for yourself. It's you do what you enjoy. So don't change your opinions or yeah, don't change your views just because your readers demand it. It's definitely important to take the responses to your articles to heart, and especially if it's constructive criticism. But what I've noticed as an editor is that sometimes writers would write something hoping that it would get a overwhelmingly positive response from their intended audience, and when it doesn't get a positive response, they tend to want to completely change their view on the subject and write something that their audience would approve of. Uh, we believe in a free market, but writing is somewhat of a different creature. A capitalist or a service provider would want to provide his consumers what they want, but a writer isn't exactly that. I mean, we're dealers in truth, and we can't change the truth or our perception of the truth just because others want it to be so. So yeah, it's important to take the constructive criticism of your articles to heart, but don't become a slave to others' opinion, especially your readers. You don't owe them anything. So writing is a method for you to convey your own ideas and not to tell people what they want to hear. So bear that in mind. Always write essentially for yourself. See it as something you enjoy doing and not something you're doing to satisfy others. Right. So next, preach to the choir. This is something that writers I've that what they've shared with me is they don't want to do this. They don't want to participate in creating an echo chamber or something like that. They want to always bring in new audiences and so forth, and that is admirable. It's important to try and get new audiences in, but don't be afraid of preaching to the choir. Writing for an audience that already agrees with what you have to say is not a bad thing, especially for political writers like ourselves. It is sometimes important to remind our core audience, people already agree with us about our ideas, or maybe tell them about new methods, new approaches to our ideas, things like that. But they already agree with it, so it's fine to preach to the choir to develop ideas, to remind ideas, to remind them of their core principles. This is quite important for libertarians because I've noticed that after a few months or years of being a libertarian, we tend to move away from our core principles and over intellectualize some of our ideas to the point that we sometimes forget our core principles. Um, and that's in my opinion that's a problem. So sometimes we need reminding of what our real core principles is, and uh, that would obviously be preaching to the choir. So it's writing isn't just about spreading your ideas to new audiences, but also about developing your existing audience and reminding your audience about the ideas they hold dear. So yeah, don't be afraid about preaching to the choir. A lot of people act as if it's a big problem. It really isn't. You can write the to people who already agree with what you have to say. You don't constantly have to challenge people. Uh, so yeah, preach to the choir every now and then. Okay, so I mentioned previously that it's not good to keep repeating yourself in the same article, and that's true. It gets tedious for the reader, it makes your article unnecessarily long. But there is another way in which you should repeat yourself, and that kind of part of the previous point where I said that you can preach to the choir. But this point is that you should feel free to repeat yourself and to repeat what others have already said. So don't repeat yourself too much in the same article, but repeat yourself over time. Um, that basically, by doing so, you'll build a brand for yourself. You'll start associating a core message with your writing brand. So what I usually write about is the rule of law and how the rule of law functions in South African society, or rather how it fails to function, unfortunately, in South African society. And that is what has become associated with my brand, and I've obviously repeated myself in that regard over and over again. Another thing was South Africa's hate speech bill. Um, on which I wrote many articles when it was first published in 2017. And my writing brand in South Africa, especially among the media, definitely became associated with the hate speech bill to the extent that I had interviews every week on television or on radio. So, in that way, I associated myself with a topic by repeating myself over time, not in the same article, but over time I wrote essentially the same article. Obviously, not verbatim the same, but I conveyed the same ideas, maybe with some new examples, some more detail here and there, less detail sometimes, and in that way I repeated myself over time. But don't only repeat yourself, but repeat what others have already said. So a lot of time I'll see writers or hear writers say that they don't want to write about a specific topic because it's been exhausted, because other people have written a lot about it and it's been written to death or something like that. But that is really not a good way to approach things, because I mean, of the what is it now, 7 billion people in the world, I really doubt everyone has seen has this topic has been exhausted for every single one of them. There are always more people who have not been faced with this type of article or this idea. So to say that it's been exhausted is wrong. I don't think that's a valid excuse for any writer, even if the publication you're writing for has many articles on the topic. I would say feel free to write on it again. The editors of that publication may say no, but that's silly. You can't really exhaust a topic. I've never really agreed with that. So if you have something to say about it, say it. Even if you have the same thing to say as someone else, say it, because it may just happen that hundreds or even one new reader may happen upon that article of yours, and that would be the first time that they're exposed to that idea. And I mean, if you uh, show your ideas to one reader, that should be a goal in and of itself. So yeah, repeat yourself and repeat others over time to build a brand for yourself, to associate yourself with a specific topic or specific topics, and feel free to repeat what others have said. You can't really exhaust a topic. You'll need to try very hard. It's very difficult, but so yeah, repeat yourself and repeat others. So my last step before I get into some into a bonus step, but this is my last real thought out tip, is that you shouldn't write for money. A lot of writers want to write for a living if they want it to become their job. That would be great. I personally would love that if I could write for a living, but very few people are willing to pay others to hear their opinion or to read their opinion. This is simply a fact of life, and you'd need to be among the best writers if you want to be paid enough to make a living just to share your opinion, which is what op-eds are. Op-eds are essentially opinion, informed opinion, but definitely opinion, and it it's extremely difficult to get paid enough or at all for op-eds. So don't make that your goal. Don't become emotionally attached to that goal, because you if if and when you miss that goal, it may demoralize you, and it will make writing a chore. You won't enjoy writing anymore. You really need to write because it's your passion. Um, you have to have a love for writing for its own sake. You should want to share your opinions with people because you think it may help them, or it may help society, or it's it's just ideas you want to share. It shouldn't be about remuneration. Um, if you want to be paid, you should likely look at a career in writing fiction. Write stories. People are willing to pay for entertainment, but it's very difficult to secure funding and real money for writing op-eds. So it should be about sharing your ideas with others, not making money. But if you do get an opportunity to write for money, take it and enjoy. I mean, that would be a real privilege for you. It should be a real honor. Uh, and yeah, you should take that opportunity, and maybe you can make it in that regard, and get paid a living wage for writing. But yeah, what I'm saying is it's very unlikely. Don't put all your eggs in that basket. You should write because you enjoy it. Okay, and that brings us to a bonus step, and that is language. So, as I prefaced this podcast with, I am not a grammatical or linguistic expert. To be completely honest, I don't remember half of the things that I was taught in English at high school. And there's no doubt in my mind that much of the tenses and words that I've used in this podcast are completely wrong and would make my high school teachers faint. Um, I'm not an expert in with language, but what I've noticed in my time as a writer is that the most important thing is to be consistent, even consistently wrong, rather than inconsistently right and wrong, and understandable. So that basically means that if you are going to misspell a particular word, now there may be a debate about whether the American or the British English spelling is the correct one, but whichever you choose, use it consistently throughout your article. And obviously, in the future, just spell the word correctly. But be consistent in your incorrect usage of a word. Um, and be consistent generally. Readers really do appreciate that, and writers tend to underappreciate how important it is to be consistent in your style and your language, because it's distracting if you're a reader. To see the same thing written differently or written or spelled differently, it's annoying, and it immediately takes your mind off what the article is actually about. So be consistent, but then also be understandable. At the risk of giving English teachers a heart attack, uh, if if you have to choose between being linguistically correct and being understandable, I would say go with being understandable rather than getting your grammar or your language correct. All right. So if you have a choice between a word that nobody has heard before, a very complicated word that nobody would understand, and a different word which is wrong in the circumstances but would make it understandable for your readers, then I would say go with the latter. I mean, it's wrong, but for your purposes of writing an op-ed, it's okay, I would say, because at the end of the day, you want your readers to understand the message you're trying to convey. You do not want to win a prize in English, or you don't want to get a high school diploma. You want to convey an idea to your readers, and I mean, this is what they taught us in law school, which I found very liberating in a way. Is that if there isn't a word for something that you're trying to say, make one up. And I found that that really opened my eyes, and I think that's something that any writer should take to heart. Be understandable and err on the side of of understandability rather than correct language. But of course, your use of language should be correct insofar as is possible. Don't be purposefully incorrect unless it's an understandability problem. But as far as language and linguistics go, try to get it right. In general, just as a general rule. Right. So the best way to get language right is to read more English and to imitate it. The more English you read, the better you're gonna write it, and that's really something that I think anyone who's been a writer for a while can attest to. You will become good at writing English if you read a lot of English, and so certainly if you want to be successful at writing, you need to love reading. Uh, the point about punctuation is definitely important. Your commas and exclamation marks and question marks must hug the word preceding it. There is never a space before punctuation. This is a very, 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 very common problem that I see. And I mean, the moment I read it in any kind of article, I stop reading that article because it tells me that the writer didn't take his writing seriously. Uh, just get your punctuation right, especially your apostrophe s. The apostrophe s indicates possession, uh, and it's never plural. Never use an apostrophe s to indicate a plural. That is just wrong. And it's if as a reader you notice that, you're immediately annoyed with the writer. So definitely get that right. Another idea, when in doubt, avoid all caps and then exclamation marks. So rather just avoid all caps entirely. Never write a word in all caps. It's not even shouting. An exclamation mark is shouting. All caps just seems very childish. So prefer using bold or italic, even underline, or emphasize the word in another way. Just try to avoid all caps. And exclamation marks, use them very sparingly. It's not it's when you read something with an exclamation mark, it's not necessarily you're not necessarily more inspired or necessarily agree with the writer more. It's sometimes it comes off as pretentious sometimes. So use it very sparingly. Definitely not more than once or twice in one article. And please, not a triple exclamation mark. One exclamation mark. Never more than one exclamation mark in a specific sentence. This thing about two or three exclamation marks right after one another. That just just don't do that. And the final tip that I have about language, use short sentences. For people who aren't experienced writers, please use short sentences. It makes it easier for your editor to follow what you're trying to say, because if you're not experienced, it's going to be difficult sometimes for them to follow what you're saying, and for the readers, of course. But if your sentence drags on, it's gonna become a big head scratcher for them to determine what is going on here. So when in doubt, stop the sentence right there and start a new one. When you have to think about whether it's a comma or a full stop here, put a full stop. Don't even think about it anymore. Just put a full stop and start the next sentence immediately, because it's really, I mean, if you read John Locke's Two Treatises of Government, he has sentences that goes on for several paragraphs. I couldn't get halfway into that book before I had to put it down. It's we're not writing old English anymore. Uh, New English is all about understandability, and to make it more understandable, you really need to keep your sentences short. And that's about it. I hope these tips have been somewhat useful, be somewhat useful to you. Uh, like I said, they're not expert tips or anything like that. They're just my thoughts and my reflections on what I've learned over the last few years as a writer. So yeah, take it as you will. These tips may not work for everyone. They definitely worked for me and continue to work for me, and I hope you'll find some use for them. So let me just repeat every tip before I stop the podcast. So the first tip: do not overthink your project. Do not overthink writing. That's basically it. Do not overthink it. Second tip: start with your conclusion. Third tip: summarize your conclusion in your opening paragraph. Fourth tip: brevity is best. Fifth tip: don't be a slave to popular opinion. Sixth tip: preach to the choir. Seventh tip: repeat yourself and repeat others. Eighth tip: don't write for money. And the bonus or ninth tip is just the ideas that I shared with you about language. And that's it. I hope these ideas help. Have a great day.